Welcome to the Art Against Mental Illness podcast. My name is Alex Lovelace and this is my podcast about the healing powers of art for artists, art lovers, the art curious and anyone with an interest in mental health and well-being. There is, according to some people, a right way and a wrong way of doing things. This is an assertion I usually disagree with. I say usually because in the most philosophical sense, any such sweeping assertions as there is a right way of doing things is dubious to the point of idiocy. But by that same yardstick, so is saying I always disagree with such assertions. I think you can already get a flavour of where this is going to go. Strap in, kiddies, this is going to get deep. Take the seemingly obvious and self-evident mathematical axiom that 1 + 1 = 2. Philosophical legends Bertrand Russell and Alfred Whitehead reputedly spent 360 pages of their epic treatise, Principia Mathematica, demonstrating that this is indeed the case. This suggests that there is more than one way to skin that particular numerical feline. So the idea that there is, for example, only one way to approach creating an oil painting of an apple on a plate has a strong stench of nonsense. Yet classically inclined artists tell us that we should learn to do things in a certain way, which is, to them, the correct way. This is especially true for those artists that went to some prestigious school to learn to do things the supposed right way. In reality, this is less of a thing these days, especially since most artists don't go to art school anymore, and those that do are just as likely to be encouraged to fill a building with concrete as paint a nude. However, even among those of us who are self-taught, the imprint of the supposed rules, the do's and don'ts, cardinal sins, etc., echo from blog posts and YouTube videos and turn up to haunt us at the most inopportune moments. Here's one that you tend to hear a lot. When painting, don't use black paint. This is, we are told, because the colour black really doesn't actually show up much in the real world, and where it does, it's not really actually black, just dark all the other colours. This is, in fact, broadly true, although it applies to all the other colours too, and obviously black holes. More importantly, blacks tend to be a little flat and lifeless and are often used by novices to darken other colours, which depending on the colour and the type and the amount of black you use, will often not lead to the colour that you want and will frequently lead to some sort of horrible off-brown or grey. Darkening hues can almost always be achieved more effectively and to better effect using other colours. For example, your candidate colours complement. A similar issue arises when trying to lighten a colour with white. Colour theory is for another day though. Anyway, don't use black is not the worst advice. Good advice even. Some extremely able and important artists simply don't have it in their palette at all. Good on them. But here's the thing. I like black. I use it all the time. I've got over 100 black t-shirts. I use all sorts of shades of it. I particularly like to combine it with another supposedly rookie error that sets classical artists' teeth on edge, putting lines around depictions of three-dimensional things. Most children, when asked to draw a human, will draw his or her outline first, then fill in the details and then daub it in glorious technicolor. But unless you happen to live in Springfield, then you'll note that humans don't have black lines around them. It's one of the first things you get beaten out of you if you start taking visual arts at all seriously. However, one of my artistic heroes is Alphonse Mucha. Go ahead and Google his work. On his posters at least, he put dark lines around all his humans, usually women, and everything else for that matter. And if Mucha does it, then you can bet your last pair of clean knickers that I do too. And guess what my favourite colour to do this with is? There are effects, particularly when looking to create brutal contrast or the aforementioned non-existent lines that simply can't be achieved without lifeless old black. Maybe you think that my art is no better than that of a play school kid, but I think it looks great. And if it grates on some people that I use thick black lines around my humans, those are just the sort of people I exist to be the metaphorical lemon juice in the eye of. Why? Because, that's why. And more specifically, as we'll see, I don't like being told what to do. The black stays. Some rules, however, transcend the more asinine if you do this, then bad outcomes will ensue. Some dictates fall into the more dangerous category of you can't do that, it's cheating, or the slightly less alarming but somehow more insidious, that's just not how we do things, darling. The application of such techniques and approaches not only risks creating something less than perfect, or perhaps more than perfect, but to be discovered using them risks actual social ostracisation or ridicule, at the very least side-eye and muttered disdain. Here's some things that fall into that category. Tracing and or using grids to capture form and composition. Using AI for any creative process at all. Using an auto-tuner when singing live. Eschewing proper grammar and punctuation. Ever try to read Joyce or Woolf? Not taking yourself and or your art very seriously, God forbid. Probably lots more. For example, I use tracing for my drawing. Specifically, I use trace down or carbon paper, those black sheets that when you write on them creates the equivalent black marks on the paper below. I'm very good at pencil drawing. My works are delicate and detailed. It took me a long time to get this good, a lot of practice, so I can take an image and transfer it to a bit of paper freehand. I just choose not to. Why? Because it's hard and tedious and always ends up looking a little bit off. So what, you might say? Do I not feel that I must suffer for my art? Do you not bang on about process all the time and how one should embrace the mundanity? And you would be correct. And I do occasionally do this stuff freehand, just to prove to myself that I can. But really, I'm not doing it for myself at all. I'm doing it to get your voice out of my damn head. You see, my process is filled up with bits that are either necessary for the outcomes that I seek, or that I find pleasurable or relaxing to do. And since relaxation is the primary goal, I tend to prioritise the stuff that facilitates that, which means less fiddling with the exact position of a nose and more soothing, mindful shading. Remember geography class, when you used to find trying to colour inside the country boundaries oddly relaxing? It's like that. But it does leave me with a nagging sense of imposter syndrome, which is the enemy of healing. Let me state this with absolute clarity. Self-doubt, of which imposter syndrome is a form, and its ugly cousin, low self-esteem, are arguably the biggest enemies of good mental health. For a long time, I wouldn't talk about my technique and approaches to art because I was afraid that someone would call me out, which is of course completely irrational. It's worth noting that this at least is in part yet another neurodivergence thing. Us weirdos tend to have spent most of our existence being told by some person or another, in one way or another, that some thing or another that we are doing or being was somehow wrong, and frequently finding ourselves ostracised or otherwise being punished for doing, saying, drawing, thinking it. Most of the time, it's not at all clear what we are doing that is so obnoxious to the delicate sensitivities of neurotypicals, or indeed why it was wrong at all. It leaves one a bit sensitive to criticism, and sometimes irrationally so. What's ironic is that I'm a habitual breaker of rules, especially if it's not absolutely clear why they exist. It's an odd quirk of the autistic mind that we both feel compelled to follow rules while being pathologically hostile to rules that seem to us to be stupid. So we tend to be staunch, law-abiding citizens while aggressively shunning all the various unfathomable social conventions, at least the ones where we think we can get away with doing so. And if you want to really entertain yourself by how warped my brain is, Google pathological demand avoidance, aka PDA. Actually don't, I'll put a link in the show notes. Far be it from me to tell you what to do. I digress, but suffice to say that if you tell me I shouldn't use black paint, you can bet your bottom dollar that I'm going to do so, all the while feeling like a bit of a fraud for doing it. Go figure. And here's the rub. One of the things that attracts me to art is the boundary pushing. Many people associate art with aesthetics. If things aren't nice, they ain't art. So Bob Ross and Coldplay are art, but Martin Creed and Napalm Death aren't. Creed won the Turner Prize for turning a light on and off again. But in my mind, aesthetics is but a small feature of the artistic endeavours, and an extremely subjective one. I'd much prefer to listen to Napalm Death than Coldplay, and musically Napalm were far more inventive and groundbreaking despite all the shouting and sweating. Art, for me at least, is about creation, and therefore dull reproduction and repetition barely qualifies. If the machine at the Heinz factory can produce millions of something, then it's not art, no matter how beautiful. This is, of course, a large part of what Warhol and the pop artists were alluding to. So when Michael Craig Martin put a glass of water on a shelf in a gallery and called it an oak tree, people quite reasonably said, if that's art, then anything can be art, which is precisely right and precisely wrong at the same time. It's not a nuanced point either. If something is presented as art, then it is art. A can of soup on a supermarket shelf is not a work of art, but if you can convince someone to put it in a gallery, then it is. Whether that constitutes good art is a nuanced point. Let's pretend, for the sake of this conversation, that the Heinz tin in the gallery is good art. If someone buys the exact same brand of soup and puts it in the gallery next door, then that is art too. But that most likely is bad art by merit of being derivative alone. If every gallery in the world had the same tin, then there's some theoretical point when that particular item stops being art and magically transforms back into a commodity, and we start calling galleries supermarkets. The point is, repetition is the death of art. Any item reproduced in sufficient numbers degrades the value to the point where it is worthless, and anything that has no intrinsic worth cannot, by definition, be art. The contents of each of those soup tins will vary slightly. They are, at their very essence, unique, but to all intents and purposes they are the same. At the macro level, they have very little intrinsic value outside of their utility and what that's worth to any given shopper. We've strayed into economics here. It's a subject for another day, but art and economics are bedfellows, as icky as that makes all us creatives feel. Back to my core thesis. If repetition is the death of art, then uniqueness is its beating heart. Art thrives on novelty. Art requires novelty. Just try and record a Radiohead song without permission and see what happens. I dare you. And you know what stifles novelty? Rules. Bloody rules. In fact, it's arguable that rules exist specifically to curb novelty. The game of chess wouldn't be much fun for anyone if people only followed the rules that they liked. There's an obvious counter to this argument, which is that even by sticking precisely to the rules, there are, to all intents and purposes, a near infinite number of possible chess games. Which is true, but most of those chess games are so pointless and silly that they can be ignored. What's left is largely dictated by probability and the conventions of the chess community, and for the purpose of this argument, conventions are just pseudo-rules that can and should be broken. Deep Blue didn't beat Kasparov by sticking to convention. So if art is so conceptually broad that it strays into economics and soup, then is it not the same as saying that there are no rules to be broken? And this brings us back to my beloved black paint. You see, there is always good taste, historical context, personal reputation, broader societal dictates and taboos, and a raft of other ambient conditions to consider. In short, context. Banksy would have been laughed out of the Royal Academy 100 years ago, but there is nary a middle-class abode that doesn't bear his imprint somewhere, if only on the side of a coffee cup. We'll sidestep that he would have never turned up at the RA, since then everyone would know who he is, but you get my point. Miles Davis, arguably one of the most important and inventive musicians of all time, would have been laughed out of every jazz club were he to have tried to play his seminal Some Kind of Blue 20 years earlier. Art, or indeed any creation that in retrospect can be tagged as ahead of its time, was, in its time, considered pointless drivel and subjected to ridicule, or more likely completely ignored. There is no point staring at your 6-foot sculpture of Margaret Thatcher made entirely of Babybel wax and feeling that your genius is being shunned, since you don't get to ascribe genius to yourself. Only other people can do that. And those others are almost always the very gatekeepers of taste and decorum that gleefully creates the rules to which you find yourself on the wrong side of. It's a catch-22. So where does this leave us? If shunning the rules is the equivalent of biting the hand that feeds you, then are we not all doomed to mindless reproduction? Well, the existence and popularity of Banksy would suggest otherwise. Acceptance by and to the establishment is only important if you care about such things, and the vast majority of people in the creative community don't. But it's worth observing the rules for a couple of reasons. 1. Many of them exist for a reason, and although that doesn't mean you can't ignore that reason, it's worth at least understanding it before chucking it out. Pollock didn't use a bucket and a string because he didn't know how paintbrushes worked. 2. Rules are fun to break, and you can only break them if you know that they're there. But from my perspective, learn the rules. Don't. It's not important. Rules are only important if they get in the way of you enjoying yourself. There are plenty of rules that I happily follow, and I'm hardly aware that they're even there because they suit me. But you can be sure that if they started getting in my way, I would drop them without missing a beat. Does that mean my art isn't acceptable? I don't think I'm particularly radical. To be honest, I suspect my art is pretty pedestrian. Some people like it, some don't. Most are blissfully unaware that I exist at all. So since I largely don't care what the establishment would think of me if they knew I existed, and that I think lots of the rules are stupid anyway, why would I feel imposter syndrome? Well, it's been a choppy journey, and I wasn't always this preternaturally self-assured. In fact, it's quite likely that I'm trying to convince myself as much as you. Bucking conventions is a risky business, even for an old hand like me. It comes with its own anxiety, and we are always our own worst critics. And if breaking rules wasn't a bit risky and uncomfortable, then it wouldn't be fun, would it? If breaking the rules isn't your jam, don't feel the need to do it. But you're always breaking somebody's rules, so you probably are anyway. But for those of us who like to push at the edges, stand proud and stand your ground. This is not a rallying call, it's simply a suggestion. Boat rocking can leave you a little queasy and annoy the other passengers, but this shouldn't deter you. It certainly shouldn't make you feel bad. If art is to be your release, then you need to feel unconstrained and you need to value the work that you produce, regardless of what others may think of it. Otherwise, the process is always going to feel unsatisfactory and confining, and having some real fun will seem like a guilty pleasure rather than the blossoming it should be. No homework this time, just be yourself, go revel in it. As ever, if you want to support me, I have a Patreon account at patreon.com, Alex Loveless, various social media accounts. I'm on Instagram at AlexMLoveless, Facebook, Alex Loveless Artist. Please help me keep this podcast alive and help me keep making my art. Otherwise, I'll be back soon with some more inane rambling. Bye.